Hi, Keith here with Rebel Civics on Unsafe Space. Today, I'm going to talk about the recent revelation, the announcement from the FBI that the FBI knew since 2021 that the virus likely came from the Wuhan lab. They said it was a leak, but I don't know how they knew it was a leak versus intentional. The timing is interesting. I want to talk about this a little. Now, you've probably heard the line before, it's been all over the media. But FBI Director Christopher Wray on Fox News announced that they knew with, quote, moderate certainty that the origins of the pandemic were most likely a potential lab leak in Wuhan. So the direct quote from him is the FBI has, for quite some time now, assessed that the origins of the pandemic are most likely a potential lab leak in Wuhan. That's Christopher Wray. The video is all over the place. I'm not going to bother to show it to you if you want to go look for it. He then went on to say that the problem is China. The problem is the Chinese government. The problem is the Chinese secret labs. And the problem is lax safety procedures. The politicians and the media response I find quite interesting, along with the timing here. Everybody that's watching the news would know that they're ramping up fear of China. Right now, the word is out. China is the enemy now. It's been just over a year for the war in Ukraine. They haven't really got World War III started yet, although you could argue that what's going on now is pretty much effectively that. But I think China is their backup plan. So the media response, I did a little survey of the media. I'm not going to play them. I'm just going to go through what I saw. So yeah, check this out. So here's the first one. I just did a DuckDuckGo search and I said, I want to see what everybody's saying about this. So this is Bloomberg Television. They had an episode on it, the FBI director's announcement. They had a guest. No mention of U.S. involvement. They say that China's the fault. Everybody is acting like they knew all along it could have been from the lab. These are all places that would have banned you for even mentioning that it might have been from the lab. All right, CNN. Of course, we knew it might have come from the lab. The FBI knew since 2021. Yep, it could have come from the lab. CNN went through it. They play the quote. They talk about whether or not it could have been from the lab, and they go into the problem is China. The problem is lax safety, international safety procedures. What they don't mention is the U.S. government involvement. All right, NBC News. They play the Chinese announcement that this is false. This is ludicrous. The Chinese government says that it came from the wet market. These accusations are wrong. It did not leak from the lab. Now, how they know it, they offered no evidence. NBC here just calls out the Chinese government. They say the FBI announced that it could have come from the lab, so that it was a likely cause. But anyway, Chinese government officially denies it without ever presenting any evidence one way or the other, nor did the FBI director. Next up, CBC News. The FBI director says the Chinese lab is the most likely cause of the pandemic. They blame, guess what? The Chinese government. Everybody blames the Chinese. They also call for better safety procedures at quote unquote research labs. What they don't mention is U.S. government involvement. Christopher Wray, the FBI director, his report came very shortly after an Energy Department report that the most likely source was a lab leak from the Wuhan lab, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which people have been paying attention, probably have noticed that is the most likely. But why the Energy Department is investigating it? They say they have jurisdiction over labs throughout the U.S. that do this sort of research too. I guess I didn't know the Energy Department knew about virology, but apparently they are in control of the labs. A more likely theory, maybe this can go in your conspiracy theory bucket for now until it gets proven true, as have all my conspiracy theories. But U.S. Energy Department is quite interested in Russia selling energy to Europe and to China. They don't want either. Um, the U.S. government is adamantly opposed to Russia selling any energy, and that includes China. So the Energy Department is quite interested in the Ukraine war, the pipeline blow up, and it turns out they're interested in the source of the pandemic. I assume since the Department of Energy has something to do with energy. Anyway, so this was another CNN report. What they did not mention was any U.S. government involvement in the Wuhan lab or in the pandemic or in the restrictions. They don't mention that. Next up, DW News. This is good. China hits back at the FBI COVID lab leak theory. It's a theory. It hasn't been proven. A lot of these news reports say it's unknowable. That's a word that several of these people used. The answer is unknowable. That isn't what they're actually interested in knowing, I think. They don't want the American public to believe it is a knowable question, but they are openly talking about it. So, yep, this was DW News. Very interesting. They talk about the Chinese government denies it. They talk about the Christopher Wray announcement that the FBI knew since 2021, the most likely caused, assessed the most likely caused. They didn't reveal how they assessed it. One thing that DW News didn't mention, U.S. government involvement. Next up, The Hill. Now, The Hill, you're getting a little bit of a conservative thing, but no, these are the Beltway Republican, the Beltway conservatives, hardcore big government people, right? When it comes down to it, they have a hit piece basically on China's obfuscating the investigation. Americans are confident in a lab leak theory. They talk about Christopher Wray's announcement. What they never mention is U.S. government involvement. All right, last up before I go on, this one on Today. They played a lot of the interviews, so here's a place you can watch it if you want. Christopher Wray on Bret Baier. He again says that the FBI is the most likely origin. Christopher Wray, in this one, they talk more about how the Chinese government is the problem. They're the biggest threat to world peace. We have to do something about China, and we have to do something about international safety for the lab leaks. Then they go on, they talk about TikTok as the problem and more evidence of China. It actually gets funny, you know. They have their guest is the former director Brennan of the CIA, who just goes in, reiterates over and over. The problem is China, Chinese unsafe labs controlled by the CCP, TikTok, Ukraine, China buying energy from Russia, and that's a problem. Building up Russia. China is the threat to the U.S. that we really need to worry about, and this pandemic is proof of that. What they don't mention is the U.S. government funded the lab. So anyway, that's all the ones I looked at. There's one single thing that jumps out at me at all those reports, every single one of them. No one even mentions Fauci's involvement. No one mentions the U.S. government's funding the Wuhan lab that now is the likely source. Even the government is saying it's the likely source, some parts of the government. None of these reports mentioned that. So I don't think they want to know. So there's the question. How come they don't want to know this? One thing that is clear is that they don't mention that what's clear here is that China is their next target. So the word is out. We got to go against China now. So evidently, apparently it might use, but I would say evidently the word is out to the lapdog media of the government, all those places. China's the problem. We got to talk about China. Ukraine gets a mention, but Ukraine is starting to fade. So maybe they've decided that they've used up fear of Ukraine, fear of Russia. But anyway, they're going after China. So the things, again, to reiterate, none of the reports mention that the U.S. government funded the Wuhan lab. None of the reports mention the ludicrous amount of cover-up, active cover-up, shutting down scientists' reports, banning papers that Fauci, Mike Collins, other parts of the U.S. government, the NIAID, NIH, the CDC, squashing this whole story. WHO squashing the whole even concept. We weren't even allowed to talk about the virus come from the lab. Now everybody's acting, most of these newscasters, they act like, yeah, we knew all along it might have come from the lab, and we were kind of thinking that's where it came from. That's the common thread in the news report. So the cabal has shifted the narrative. So the empire has decided that not only is it okay to talk about the lab as a source, that actually is the likely source, but it's China's fault. Another thing they never mention is, how about not doing research, gain-of-function research, taking viruses from nature and monkeying with them, doing DNA experiments and creating a virus that is more deadly than anything nature can provide on its own? How about just not doing that? No mention of that. None of those reports even hinted that they've thought of that idea. How about not having bioweapons labs? We could just not do bioweapons. How about if the world wasn't making bioweapons labs? No, they didn't think of that. They even talk about the dozens of labs that the CIA director talked about. There's dozens of labs throughout the world that are working on these sorts of things, gain-of-function research on viruses. And the only fix they talk about is more government oversight. We need international safety regulations. We need transparency of the CCP's lab. That's their solution. The last thing that none of the reports mentioned is holding U.S. officials accountable for anything to do with the virus creation, the funding, or the cover-up. So my conclusion here of this report is, number one, they don't want us to know what happened. They use the term unknowable often, and they blame it on the Chinese transparency. A good way to manipulate people is to say a little tidbit of a fact, which is that it is true that the CCP has a lot of control over the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and they're not transparent. The first thing they did is lock down information when the pandemic started. So that part's true. The rest of it is all just emotional manipulation. So start with a little tidbit of a fact and then just spew out a bunch of nonsense. That's a good trick. Number two conclusion, China is the next propaganda target. China is the target of the whole empire, the cabal, the DC mainstream and their lapdog media. China is now the target. That's what I conclude. And Christopher Wray's announcement, he said they've known since 2021. In 2021, pretty much everyone was denying it. I don't know of any FBI interview. They hadn't said one way or the other, but why now? It's interesting timing as the Ukraine war is winding down. It seems like Russia's going to get to keep Crimea and the Donbass regions, will stay independent or maybe join Russia. Sending them lots more money, but it appears that the Ukraine war is going to reach a conclusion, and it's not going to favor the most corrupt country in Europe, Ukraine, or the 51st state. So that's my third conclusion. The word is out. It's time to build fear of China. And remember, fear is the basis of all government, and they're moving on China next. For me, the day this came out, that there was the Wuhan Institute of Virology existed, and it's 10 miles or so from the wet market. I think there's two different groups, but anyway, it's in Wuhan. The theory that the virus was a random origin, developed naturally and transmitted from an animal to a human, the probability, just look at the strict from probability, that happened 10 miles from a research lab that was taking bat viruses, modifying them to make them more deadly in humans. That's what they're doing. They're funded by the US government through Fauci. So Fauci knew exactly what they're doing. Fauci was part of funding it. Mike Collins, the CDC, NIAID, through back channels to make it clandestine, but they were funding it. They knew it was going on. When the word came out that the virus is out, Fauci was adamant, like, this is a natural origin. People were saying that it's impossible. They looked at the DNA strand. It's impossible for it not to be natural. Like, this is not man-made. There's all sorts of reports. Scientists that were even bringing up the concept that might have come from a lab that happened to be working on coronaviruses developed from bats 10 miles from the place where a bat coronavirus started this. Those people, some of them had their careers ruined by Fauci. And he's given out nearly $1 trillion over his career. $1 trillion controls a lot. So $1 billion or $1 trillion? Anyway, Fauci's giving out a lot of money. I'll have to look that number up. That was from memory. The power that money has in Fauci, NIAID, CDC, NIH, WHO is enormous. And that squashes the truth. So I looked at the probability when I first said it. If you take the number, say 10 square miles around the Wuhan lab, where they're working on bat-derived coronaviruses, and say a bat-derived coronavirus naturally occurred within that 10-mile radius, take that 10-mile circle and divide it by the surface of the Earth. There's your rough probability calculation. So to me, as far as likely goes, that in itself is enough to say it's likely. Now, the FBI says it's likely, and that they knew since 2021. Why they didn't tell us, I don't know. Anyway, that's all I want to say for now. Keep this a short episode. So remember, fear is the basis of government, and the FBI is now saying that the most likely source of the pandemic is a lab leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And the FBI director matter-of-factly said that on Fox News. That's a change. That's a change that means something. So, yeah, pay attention to that. Anyway, goodbye for now, and I'll see you next week.
This production was made possible through the generous support of our members. To join our community, visit unsafespace.com. Unsafe Space is an online publication for individualists interested in subverting authoritarianism and ushering in the next enlightenment. For biting analysis and nourishing composition, or to sign up for our weekly news brief, The Abstract, visit unsafespace.com. Thanks for joining us today.
Warning. This is an unsafe space. Dangerous ideas have been detected. The content of this production has not been authorized for distribution on Apple devices. The following co-conspirators are hereby uninvited to Klaus Schwab's winter solstice party. Please be advised that CBS News has paused activity on Unsafe Space while it continues to assess security. Central bank digital currency is a safe and secure way to protect you from Sam Bankman-Fried. If you think about it, no one should be allowed to express opinions. But don't. Think about it, I mean. That's not your job. Thinking has been scientifically proven to be less efficient than compliance. Science, scientific, and scientifically are registered trademarks of the World Economic Forum. Unauthorized use is prohibited. Computer voice courtesy. Never mind, that last line is misinformation. Please disregard it and return to your safe space immediately. There will be cake.